The tent was zipped shut from the inside. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it every single day for 2 years, turned it over like a stone you keep finding in your pocket, and it still doesn't make sense. The tent was zipped shut from the inside, and there was no one in it. I pressed my hand against the fabric. I called out. Nothing moved. I need to back up. It was late October 2022. I was 34, doing a solo section hike on the Appalachian Trail through western North Carolina, a stretch I'd been planning since the previous spring. Nantahala National Forest, cold, clean air that smells like pine resin and wet granite. I'd been out 3 days. I had good boots, a good pack, and exactly 0 reason to be afraid. By the end of that day, I would understand why the ranger went pale when I described what I'd found, and I would spend the next 2 years trying to understand why he was the only person who believed me. I left the marked trail around 2 p.m. to find a water source marked on my topographic map, a small tributary feeding into the Nantahala River, maybe a quarter mile off the blaze. I'd done it before. Step off, fill up, step back on. 15 minutes. No issue. That's when I smelled the smoke. Not old smoke. The embedded, weak, dead ghost of a doused campfire. Fresh smoke. The kind that means someone is there, or was there recently enough, that the wood still has something left to say. I followed it. The campsite was in a natural depression between 2 ridgelines, screened by a wall of hemlock so dense it swallowed the ambient light. You wouldn't find it if you weren't looking. You wouldn't find it if you were looking. Unless the wind carried something your way, a 2-person dome tent, forest green, rain fly properly staked, a camp stove on a flat rock, but the pot still on the burner. The flame had gone out, but when I crouched down and held my palm over the pot, the air above it was warm. Not warm the way a fire burns down to warm. Warm the way lunch is warm. Someone had been cooking within the last hour. I called out again. The hemlocks absorbed it. I didn't touch anything. I want to be clear about that. I didn't touch anything. I didn't open the tent. I didn't look inside the pot. I just stood there in that green-shadowed hollow while the cold came down off the ridge and tried to decide if I was in someone's camp or someone's crime scene. Then I noticed the third thing, and it settled the question. The boot prints. They came from the direction of the trail, 2 sets, side by side, the way people walk together. They stopped at the tent, and then they simply stopped. No prints leaving, no prints circling the campsite, no indication that whoever made them had walked anywhere else. They arrived, and they didn't leave. I hiked out, fast. The ranger station near the Topton trailhead was a single-room building that smelled like coffee and old paperwork. The ranger on duty was maybe 50, weathered, with the kind of calm that comes from 20-odd years of managing situations most people never encounter. I told him what I'd found, described the hollow, the hemlocks, the stove, the tent, told him about the boot prints that didn't lead anywhere. He went pale. Not a subtle pallor, a real visible change, like something I'd said had drawn the blood down out of his face and somewhere else. He held up a hand, turned to his radio, and stepped outside. I watched through the window. He had a short conversation. When he came back in, his expression had rearranged itself into something careful and official. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave this area right now. Don't describe the location to anyone else, don't post about it, and don't go back." He paused. "Can you do that for me?" I asked him what was in that hollow. He said, "We'll take it from here." I have thought for 2 years about what he meant by we. 2 weeks later, I filed a formal inquiry with the National Park Service. I had the date, the time, the ranger station location, the ranger's approximate description. I expected a form letter. What I got was a phone call from an administrator who told me, in a tone that was almost pleasant, that no campsite had been found in that area. No ranger had taken a report matching my description, and there was no record of my inquiry. In the system, I drove back to Topton, the access road to the trailhead, a road I had driven 3 days before, a road I have a photo of from my dashcam, was gated, a green metal gate, padlocked with a yellow sign wired to it. Trail closed. Erosion damage. The padlock was shiny, the hinges hadn't started to rust. The sign looked like it had been printed that week. I've checked that road on Google Maps, on trail forums, on hiking databases. Every source says the trail is open. The gate doesn't exist on any map. But I have a photo of it. My dashcam caught it as I turned around. I still don't know whose campsite it was. I don't know what was in that tent, or why the prints stopped the way they did. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that makes the whole story curve back on itself in a way I can't straighten out. The ranger went pale. Before I mentioned the boot prints, he went pale the moment I described the hollow, the hemlocks, the location. He already knew what I was talking about. He'd heard this before, and whoever was in that tent, someone made sure they wouldn't be found. The next pile comes from a park ranger in Virginia. He started logging what was on the trail. His supervisor told him to stop. He didn't stop. I spent 11 years as a park ranger in the Appalachian Mountains, and I can tell you the thing most people don't understand about the deep woods. They're not empty. The absence of people is not the absence of presence. I learned that distinction slowly, the way you learn most things that matter, by being wrong for a long time before you're right in a way you can't undo. The stretch of Appalachian Trail I'm talking about runs between two backcountry shelters in the Blue Ridge section of Virginia. About 4 miles of trail that sees modest but consistent use in the spring and fall. I won't name it, not because I was told not to. I don't much care about that anymore, but because I don't want anyone going there, looking for what I found. Some things are better, not confirmed. I started noticing the foot traffic in March of my 8th year. Fresh boot prints in trail mud each morning. Fire rings in the established spots, but used and carefully covered, grey ash raked smooth, the kind of fastidious cleanup that experienced backcountry campers do, not overnight amateurs. Displaced rocks along the trail margins, the kind of disturbance that happens when multiple people move through in single file. Every morning. 0 logged overnight visitors. 0 sign-in sheets. I filed it. Standard anomaly report. My supervisor, a man I'd respected for the better part of a decade, called me the next afternoon and told me to stop filing reports on that section and redirect my attention south. I kept filing. Privately, the prints started changing in May. This is the part I've gone back and forth about including, not because I'm worried about being believed, but because I'm not sure I can describe it accurately without it sounding like something it isn't. The prints in the soft trail mud were always boot-shaped, always human-spaced in stride. But in May, I started finding a second set, intermixed with the first. Same mud, same morning, longer stride, and occasionally pressed into the softer ground near the trail margin, something that didn't have the geometry of a boot at all. I measured one, 14 inches, 5 distinct impressions where the toes would be, though the spacing was wrong. Too wide, too far apart. Like fingers, more than toes. I told myself it was a bear. I'm telling you now that I knew it wasn't a bear. I'd worked that trail for 8 years. I knew what a bear print looks like in every soil condition on that ridge. What I still can't explain is why the prints were always side by side with the boot prints, not following them, walking alongside them, at the same pace, in the same direction, as if whatever made them and whoever wore the boots were moving together. The morning I found the single print outside my window, I'd been up since 4. The ranger station I worked out of was a small structure at the end of a gravel service road, not isolated by dramatic wilderness standards, but remote enough that I was usually the only person on the property overnight. I stepped outside with my first coffee. 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late June. And I looked down because I always look down on wet mornings. Habit. 8 years of reading ground. The print was directly below the window of my office. Barefoot. Enormous. The toes were pointing toward the building, toward the glass, which meant whatever made it had been standing there, looking in. I radioed it in immediately. My supervisor drove out personally 40 minutes from his home before sunrise and stood over that print with a flashlight for a long time without saying anything. Then he straightened up, looked at me with an expression I've replayed many times since, and told me to take 2 weeks of paid leave. It wasn't a suggestion. When I came back, my report logs for the southern section had been removed from the system. My access credentials for that stretch of trail had been revoked. My station assignment had been transferred to a section 200 miles north, effective immediately. I asked my supervisor over the phone what had been in those reports that required removing them. He said the section had been reclassified. When I asked what that meant, he said he'd followed me on this job for a long time and he'd appreciated my work. But some things in the Park Service weren't filed. They were forwarded. I asked him who they were forwarded to. He said, people better equipped than us. I quit 6 months later. I have a house now, a garden, a dog who sleeps at the foot of the bed. I sleep fine mostly. My wife asks sometimes why I don't like camping anymore, and I tell her I got my fill. The truth is simpler. Whatever was walking alongside those boo prints on that trail, it was comfortable near structures. It stood outside a lighted window in the dark and looked in. It was curious about what was inside. And I work in a building with windows now. I know that doesn't change anything, but I keep the blinds down after dark. Every room, every night. File 3. A trail volunteer in the Smokies picked up a distress signal on her emergency radio. The voice gave real coordinates. They found one boot. I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story without including the last part, and I've decided I can't. If I leave it out, the rest of it sounds like a strange but explainable night in the Great Smoky Mountains, and that's not what it was, so I'm going to tell you all of it, including the part I'd never said out loud to anyone. I was a trail volunteer with the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, weekend shelter checks, minor trail maintenance, that kind of thing. September 2019, a Friday night. My assignment was a routine overnight check of 2 backcountry shelters on a trail corridor in the Tennessee section of the park. I'd done it probably 30 times. I had my gear, my check-in protocol, and a Park Service emergency radio that every registered volunteer carries, standard issue, pre-tuned to the park frequency. The signal came through around 11:40 p.m. I was in my tent, not asleep, reading with a headlamp. The radio wasn't actively on. It was on standby, the way you carry it, and it crackled to life with the particular static texture that means a transmission is incoming. What I expected was weather from the automated station or a ranger check-in. What I got was a voice, a woman's voice, calm, unhurried, the cadence of someone reading instructions. She gave coordinates, a latitude and longitude, spoken twice, clearly, in the phonetic precision of someone who has done this before. Then, one individual, non-ambulatory, shelter not viable, and then the transmission ended. I relayed it immediately to the Park Service dispatch. Within 20 minutes, a search team was moving. I want to be clear about the timeline, because this is the part the Park Service tried very hard to explain away. The coordinates the woman gave were not on any trail, not on any map I had. They fell in a section of the park that, according to every resource I had access to, contained no established shelter, no designated campsite, no trail infrastructure of any kind, just terrain. The team reached the coordinates at approximately 1:30 a.m. They found a clearing, a circle of stones, not a firing configuration. Just a circle, roughly 8 feet in diameter, arranged with the kind of deliberateness that implies specific intent. And in the center of the circle, a single boot, one boot, right-footed, size 9 or 10, a mid-weight hiking boot. No blood, no pack, no other equipment, no sign of a shelter, a tent, a fire, no sign of any person. The boot had no mate. The team searched the surrounding area for 3 hours. Nothing. I was interviewed the next morning by 2 rangers I'd never met before, not the crew I usually worked with. They were professional and thorough and very interested in the exact phrasing the voice had used. I repeated it as accurately as I could. They asked me to confirm the radio channel. I confirmed it. One of them made a note. The other said the transmission was almost certainly a radio echo. Signals bouncing off terrain in the Appalachian Mountains in unusual atmospheric conditions, picking up a fragment of a hiker's conversation much further north and retransmitting it in altered form. A known phenomenon, he said. Well documented. He said it the way people say things that are technically possible, but functionally false. They asked me not to post about it online. I said I understood. The drive home was 2 hours. I was 40 minutes out of the park, on a state route outside of Severill, when the radio, which was still in my passenger seat, still in standby, came to life again. Same voice, same cadence, same coordinates spoken twice. And then, at the end, a sentence that had not been in the original transmission. I'm not going to repeat it. I've thought carefully about this, and I'm not going to repeat it. Not because I think it means something specific. I genuinely don't know what it means. But the sound of it, the quality of a human voice saying those particular words, in that particular tone. At 11:15 at night on a dark road, I pulled over and sat in my car for 20 minutes with my hazards on before I could drive again. I returned the radio to the park service the following week. I told them the battery had failed. I never volunteered again. What I think about sometimes, not often, but sometimes, is that the coordinates the voice gave were real. The teen found the clearing, the circle, the boot. Whatever the voice was, it wasn't wrong about the location. It knew exactly where to send people. The question I can't answer and can't stop asking is why. File 4. A father and son on a trail they'd hiked a dozen times. They walked for 3 hours and never reached a landmark 45 minutes away. My son called it first, and that's the part I haven't been able to let go of. We were 40 minutes into a section of the Appalachian Trail in central Pennsylvania, a stretch in the Blue Mountain corridor that Nathan and I had hiked more times than I can accurately count. He's 16, has been on trails since he could carry a pack. Solid kid, good instincts, not prone to dramatics. When he stopped in the middle of the trail and said, without turning around, "Dad, does this look right to you?" I felt something I didn't have a word for yet. I looked at the trail ahead. The white blazes were correct, spaced right, painted fresh. The terrain matched my map. The tree canopy was the same mixed oak and mountain laurel we'd been walking under all morning. Everything was exactly right, and something was wrong, in a way that I am not equipped to describe, even now, even having had 4 years to find language for it. I told him it looked fine. We pressed on. That was my mistake. And I'd made peace with it, mostly. We were 2 miles from a road shelter that we'd used as a lunch spot on probably 8 or 9 previous hikes. 45 minutes, tops. I knew this trail the way you know a street you grew up on. 3 hours later, we hadn't reached it. The blazes were still there. The map still matched. The trail was continuous. No forks, no unmarked junctions, no place where we could have meaningfully diverted. We simply walked, and the shelter did not appear. The sun moved across the sky in the wrong proportion to the distance we should have been covering. Nathan stopped talking somewhere in the second hour. I told him we were probably moving slower than I thought. I told him the elevation profile was steeper than I remembered. I kept finding reasons. At the 3-hour mark, I said we should turn back. We had been hiking through that section for 3 hours. We had not yet reached a point that, on every previous hike, had taken us 45 minutes. We turned around. 18 minutes later, the shelter appeared. Not ahead of us, behind us. We were walking away from the trailhead, and the shelter materialized where the trail bent around a granite outcropping, exactly where it had always been, where it had been on every previous trip. Nathan stopped and stared at it for a moment. Then he said quietly, "We walked past this. I don't have an explanation for that. I've gone over it many times looking for the rational architecture, a navigational error, a perception gap, trail fatigue. What I cannot square is the math. We walked for 3 hours in a direction. We turned around. 18 minutes later, a fixed structure appeared behind us that should have taken 45 minutes to reach from our starting point. The geometry doesn't work." The ranger at the trailhead was waiting when we came down, not in a dramatic way. He was there in the way rangers are sometimes there at busy access points, checking in with day hikers. But he looked at us and asked, without preamble, if we'd seen anything unusual on the trail. I said no. Nathan was quiet. The ranger nodded slowly, made a note on his clipboard and said, "You're the third group this month to come off that section early." I asked him what the first 2 groups had seen. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at Nathan. Then he looked back at me and said, "Have a safe drive home," and walked toward the trailhead kiosk. He didn't tell us what they'd seen. I didn't ask again. There was something in his tone that made the question feel like a door. I didn't actually want to open. Nathan was quiet for most of the drive home. Somewhere around the Delaware Water Gap, he said, the blazes were right. The trail was right. We were on the right trail. I told him I knew. He said, "So where were we?" "For 3 hours. I've been thinking about that question since 2020. I haven't taken Nathan back to that section. When he asks about it, and he still asks occasionally, I tell him we'll find somewhere new. He's never pushed it. I think he's grateful. I don't push it either. There are more documented cases of hikers losing time, losing direction, losing themselves in that corridor than in almost any other section of the Appalachian Trail. Researchers have catalogued them. Families have filed reports. The terrain is well mapped, well blazed, well traveled. None of that seems to matter somehow in certain sections of the Blue Mountains. Nathan said it first. He said it looked wrong. I told him it looked fine. The shelter was behind us. We had walked past it without seeing it. I've been a careful person my whole life, and I cannot explain how that happens. I can't explain it, and I can't stop trying. The final file. A woman inherits her grandfather's ranger journals. The last entry says he filed a report. They told him not to. There is no report. My grandfather kept his journals in a fireproof box in the back of his bedroom closet. 40 years of daily log entries, 42 individual notebooks with marbled covers, each one labeled in his clean, even hand, with the year and the section of trail he'd patrolled. He died in the winter of 2021 at 81, having spent more time in the Appalachian Mountains than most people spend in their own neighborhoods. He was meticulous. He was steady. He was not a man given to invention or embellishment. These things matter. For what I'm about to tell you, my aunt handed me the box at the estate sale because she knew I was the one who'd spent weekends hiking with him as a kid, the one who'd inherited his particular affinity for trails and tree lines and the specific silence of high elevation. "You'll know what to do with these," she said. I didn't, not really, but I took them home. I started with the early ones, 1975, 1976, 1977. His Tennessee Section Patrol, a remote stretch of Appalachian Trail that he covered for most of his career. The entries are beautiful in their plainness. Weather, trail conditions, wildlife counts. Footbridge maintenance at a creek crossing I actually remember visiting with him as a child. The handwriting is confident and open, with the long loops and generous spacing of a man who has all the time he needs. I could have read them for months and found nothing more than the quiet record of a life well spent outdoors. I almost missed it. The change starts in a notebook labeled 1987. It doesn't happen immediately. The first 70 pages of that journal are normal. The same cadence, the same subjects, the same steady hand. And then, in an entry dated June 14th, there's a sentence that stops the rhythm entirely. Saw the same man at Cosby Knob Shelter today that I logged at Icewater Spring 3 days ago. No vehicle access to either. Check the permit registry for both. No registration and any name matching his description. Will log again if repeated. June 17th. Repeated. June 22nd. Same man. Different shelter. He was at Double Spring Gap this morning. That's 18 miles from where I saw him Tuesday. No road access. No other hikers reported passing him. He didn't speak. He watched me log the shelter register and then walked north on the trail. I watched him for about a quarter mile before the tree line took him. His stride was wrong. I don't have better language for it than that. Then, July 8th, a longer entry. The handwriting still controlled, but pressed harder into the page. The letters slightly smaller than before. The sounds started last week. I have not been able to identify them. Not animal, not mechanical. I know this section of trail better than I know my own driveway, and I am not able to place what I'm hearing. I stopped writing it down in my official logs. I don't know why. I just know I don't want it on record. The gap runs from July 19th to September 2nd, 6 weeks. The pages are there. He didn't tear them out, but they're blank. Just empty, lined pages in the middle of an otherwise complete journal. I held them up to window to see if something had faded. Nothing. He simply stopped writing for 6 weeks, and then he started again. The handwriting when it resumes is different, tighter, smaller. The loops are gone. It looks like the penmanship of a man writing in poor light, or writing quickly, or writing while trying not to be seen. It does not look like the handwriting of the man who wrote the first 70 pages of that journal. It looks like the handwriting of someone who has learned to be careful. In a way, he wasn't careful before. The entries from September 2nd onward are brief and factual, and reveal almost nothing about whatever happened in those 6 weeks. Trail conditions, weather, routine maintenance. He writes about these things in the compressed, precise manner of someone who has decided that the page is not safe. And then, September 29th, 1987. The final entry in the 1987 journal, written in that same tight, small hand, with a period at the end of each sentence that looks like it was pressed hard enough to dimple the page. I filed the report. They told me not to. I filed it anyway. If you're reading this, I didn't finish the season. He finished the season. He finished 22 more seasons after that. He retired in 2009, attended my cousin's wedding in 2013, drove himself to doctor's appointments until he was 79, and spent the last years of his life in a comfortable house in Maryville, Tennessee, watching birds from his back porch with binoculars that had made the trip to Appalachian shelters and back, more times than anyone counted. He never mentioned the journals, not once, to anyone in the family. In 34 years, I have spent 11 months searching every public records database I can access. National Park Service archives, Tennessee state records, FOIA requests through 2 different filing services. Whatever my grandfather reported in September of 1987, on a remote section of Appalachian Trail in Tennessee, at the end of a summer that left 6 weeks of blank pages in the journal of one of the most meticulous men I have ever known. There is no record of it. The report doesn't exist. The submission doesn't exist. The case number, if there was one, has no entry in any system I can reach. I have the journals. I have 42 notebooks covering 40 years. The handwriting in the 1987 volume never fully recovers its original form. Every journal from 1988 forward is written in that tighter, more careful hand. He was out there for 22 more seasons, walking the same trails, checking the same shelters, logging the same weather. I need to believe he was all right. I need to believe that whatever he encountered in that summer, whatever left 6 weeks of silence in a man who wrote every day, he eventually made his peace with it. But I keep coming back to the last entry, to the specific grammar of it. If you're reading this, I didn't finish the season. He finished the season, so why did he write it? As if he thought he wouldn't. What did he know in September of 1987 that made him believe he might not make it? To October, I'm the only one in the family who has read the journals all the way through. I haven't decided yet whether to tell my aunt what's in them. I haven't decided whether knowing would comfort her or take something away from the man she remembers. I go back and forth. Mostly I just read them again, from the beginning, looking for something I missed. Some earlier entry that explains the summer of 1987, some note in the margins, some detail that recontextualizes the silence. I haven't found it yet, but I'm still looking. That's the thing about my grandfather. He taught me to be thorough. He taught me that the trail always has something left to show you if you're willing to go far enough in. I just don't know anymore whether that's a comfort or a warning. The archive closes here. These are true horror stories, and there are more waiting. Subscribe, submit your own file, and watch the next case on screen now.